Well, welcome everybody. We are going to be having our Train Smart episode, talk about training in a team sport environment. So we got Joey Harty on as a guest. We're going to be talking a lot of different things just between acute and chronic workload ratios, just different types of strategies to kind of implement within a training session with multiple athletes. But first and foremost, I will let Joey take it away and kind of explain who he is, his background, education, and all that.
Awesome. Thanks for having me on, Dan. It's really a privilege to be with you guys. So I guess a little bit about me. I'm originally from Fort Collins, Colorado. Grew up near the Rocky Mountains. Played soccer my whole life growing up. Ended up going down to a small Division II school at the time. It was called Grand Canyon University.
Yep.
Since then, it's actually blown up. You probably see commercials all over the place, especially down in Utah.
Yep.
But yeah, no, I ended up having the privilege to play soccer there. My interest in kind of strength conditioning really peaked probably earlier than most. It was in my high school. I was training at a little sports performance gym at a little arena soccer complex that I worked at. And it was actually a pretty cool setup. They had a little soccer field, some volleyball courts, basketball court, and then they had a gym in there. So I was training with this guy, and I was working, reffing soccer games, kind of doing all of that. And just started to realize I had a passion for everything that this guy was doing, and I started to intern with him. So then he would give me my training sessions for free. So, I was doing little things in high school, just kind of setting up his cones, just watching him, and, then jumping in the sessions when I could. So when I went into college, and I had a pretty clear idea of whatever that is that guy does, I kind of want to figure that out. So I remember I sat down with my college advisor, and I was like, what degrees do you have that kind of puts me down this path? I probably went about a little bit of a backwards way. I went there for soccer, and then as opposed to academics first, which I should have thought about that differently, but it ended up working out. Priorities at the time. But then he ended up telling me, he's like, well, you could try like an athletic training degree. So I'm like, cool, athletic trainer. That sounds down the route. I didn't really even acknowledge at the time that it was more medical than performance or whatever that boundary is. So I started doing that. And once I kind of got into the meat of my classes of my undergrad, I realized that it was probably more like an exercise science degree that I was looking for. Yep. So I ended up switching majors, did a exercise science degree, finished out playing soccer there. And through that, I was interning with our strength conditioning department at Grand Canyon. Was just able to, kind of similarly as a student worker, getting paid hourly, just helping out initially, just setting stuff up. And then by my senior year, as I was transitioning, out of playing and kind of that whole realm of things, I was able to start working with teams and kind of helping out. And my role had grew a little bit, especially with the soccer team.
Nice.
And then that led into me getting a GA spot at the school, a graduate assistant. So then I was in charge of the men's and women's soccer programs and the men's and women's tennis programs at Grand Canyon, doing all their strength conditioning work. And then I was studying, they didn't have any specifically like exercise science masters or anything like that, which I was bummed about. But, I think what's been kind of unique about my journey is being able to get, a lot of experience pretty young, which I've been fortunate. Is just the right people that have given me a lot more responsibility than I definitely should have had at the times that I've had it. So definitely learning through trial and error and all of that. So then with that, I was also working with a couple youth soccer clubs down in the Phoenix area, doing some, as their like head fitness coach, if you will, running warm-ups for, ages U12 all the way up to U18. And then I started to get, some more clientele with that. And there's actually a second division professional soccer team in Arizona. And so there's kind of this tier systems like MLS, USL, and then it kind of goes down from there. So this is a USL soccer team.
Yep.
And so I ended up being able to kind of get my way in with training a few of their guys just that I had met. And they liked the stuff that I was doing, so they introduced me to their coach. And they didn't have a fitness coach or a strength conditioning coach, whatever you want to call it. And so he, he's like, hey, if you're interested, we could definitely use some help. So I ended up spending a whole year there as their head strength conditioning coach.
That's awesome.
But it was while I was still doing a lot of other stuff. So I actually wasn't getting paid by that club at all. I was just kind of volunteering my time. And it ended up paying off because then through them, through the connections that I made with that coach, there was an opportunity that came up for the head academy performance coach here in Kansas City with the current club that I'm at, and that's Sporting Kansas City.
Nice.
So, at the time I was a little bit naive. I didn't really know what the whole soccer structure was. I was kind of thinking, oh, well, I'm working in professional. I'd like to get another professional soccer job. But this was a very good club, well respected by a lot of people just in the soccer world. So I went ahead and took that role with the youth academy system, and it ended up being just an awesome learning experience. The role was much more than I was even prepared for. We have a U12, a U13, a U14, U17, and U19 teams.
Wow.
So all different age groups. Within those age groups, it's a pretty big deal. They recruit a lot of kids from around the country to come, and they'll actually host the kids with different families in the city. So it's a pretty competitive environment to get these kids adequately prepared for what our goal is of pushing them through to the professional ranks, which is our USL team and then our senior team.
Nice.
In the MLS. With that, I spent a year in that role, and I was able to spend a lot of time with my boss and the other guys that I worked with, and just, I was working long days, just being there at every session. We had USL sessions, MLS sessions, the academy sessions. I was there from 7 to 8 pretty much every day that whole first year, just soaking everything in. It was a great learning experience for me. And with that, then I got an opportunity to kind of take a next step the next season and oversee our USL team. They're called Swope Park Rangers. So I did that for a year, still just, really trying to absorb a lot, building relationships with the staff that I was working with. And then we ended up getting a new training facility for our senior team. And so we had a facility, our old facility became just developmental. So it was all of our academy teams and our USL team. And then the senior team moved out to a new training center. So at that moment, they ended up hiring me as the strength conditioning coach for the senior team. And I was directly under our sports performance director, and we kind of tag teamed all components of sports performance with that team. And that was in 2018. And then just this past June, I ended up transitioning into our director of sports performance role.
Nice. Congrats.
Thanks, man. I appreciate that. So now we're, kind of restructuring things a little bit, but that's a little bit of my background. Obviously a heavy soccer focus, but I think that's just, by chance, the way things have gone. I'm kind of looking to keep progressing in that way, but, hopefully we can keep getting good people on our staff. And that's what it's all about, is just working with the right people, get the right people in the right environment. And that's where I think growth comes.
Absolutely, man. Well, you've had a great experience so far. Everything that you've done has been outstanding. You could definitely see that your niche is within soccer. A lot of your focus is within your experiences, professional experiences, internships, and graduate assistant and all that. You were overseeing a lot of the soccer disciplines, which is great. That's something that you found out that you loved and you went for it. Obviously you played soccer and you did all that. Actually, I had a question that kind of just popped up.
Yep.
You said that they didn't have a master's degree in exercise science. So what'd you end up doing for your degree when you were being a GA?
Yeah, so it was actually interesting. So I ended up doing, because they didn't have exercise science, I'm like, oh, great, well, I'll do two masters. So I was just, trying to decide what's best. So they had a master's of science in leadership, which was more along the psychology line of the spectrum, which I was like, wow, that's awesome. And going through that degree was a lot more emphasis on, just coaching science, leadership, stuff that really intrigued me. But then the other thing that I was doing also was my MBA.
Nice. Wow.
As you know, with owning your own business, that's a huge part of our profession. So that was kind of I was weighing both. But because I was doing both, I ended up getting the job in Kansas City before I ended up finishing both degrees.
Okay.
So now I'm actually in the process of kind of deciding what's the best route. Do I want to go back and finish one of those, because they were obviously paying for it when I was a graduate assistant, or if I'm going to go the route and kind of do something that's more like a graduate certificate in exercise science.
Nice.
But I have 13 credits left on both, so it's kind of just figuring out the best way to do it.
That's awesome, man. Well, I love that because it's not necessarily where I think a lot of like strength coaches are just disciplined within exercise science.
Yep.
You have that broad arrangement of like the psychological, the coaching science, but then all of a sudden now you have a little bit of the business administration, which, like you said, man, like going into a business or just going into a very corporate facility such as the club that you're at, like you need to know business. Like there's business behind anything that you do, and that's awesome. I mean, provides definitely the biggest thing. Well, good luck selecting that, man, because that's definitely something that it's one of those decisions that comes with a lot of responsibility within that time. It's kind of like Spider-Man within that time.
No, exactly. And it was honestly, it was a tough decision for me at the time of, you're kind of weighing, especially when I first came out here. I mean, I wasn't making much money at all, and so I was already got student loans from my undergrad, so to leave the graduate assistant, I'm leaving free education. I could have stayed and finished those, but I kind of chose experience over academics at the time, though I value academics greatly and, still am kind of pursuing that route.
Oh, absolutely.
Definitely one of those things that, I would probably advise anyone else in my shoes. I don't regret it at all. I think some people sometimes get caught up on, not taking a step because they need to focus on where they are right now. But if it's what you want to do, and you never know what can happen.
Absolutely, man. I mean, the thing is, I've always said this, everything happens for a reason. Like you chose that route just because you felt like it was appropriate for you to move in that direction. Like you said, you chose experience, which is absolutely fine. Yep. I mean, like you said, like it could take you maybe like a semester just to go back, maybe 2 semesters just to go back and receive that degree. But I look forward to this episode. I mean, we are going to be talking about a lot of different things, definitely when it comes into the team environment, and you have great value towards that. Like you've been doing a good job. Obviously, you are now the director of sports performance at your club. So you have that broad arrangement of just so many different things that you have to look at as a director. I mean, back in the day, it's like, being an intern, you kind of just focus on absorbing everything, but now you are the person that holds that role. But kind of my first question for you is, what do you enjoy most about working in that team environment? What really holds your passion for it?
Yeah, I think the biggest thing I was actually, as you sent me that question, it was kind of processing, is it's something with either the relationships or is it the competitive nature of what we do? There's something that just like if, anyone who's ever played sports growing up, there's something about just being a part of a team,
yep.
And you're really able to see something all the way through. And I think that's the biggest thing is, day in and day out, we're working towards the same goal with the same group of guys, and there's ups and there's downs. But you really start to build a brotherhood with the guys that you work with on the staff, but also the athletes that you handle. It's very relational what we do. Coaching in general is relational. But again, there's a lot of time spent with these guys. I think we had and it's a grind. We had a branch, a period of time at the beginning of preseason where we were gone 54 of 60 days.
Wow.
So being on the road that much with those guys, I mean, you really develop a relationship and a level of trust where it's the camaraderie that you're all working towards one goal. So I think that's probably the biggest thing. It's just the relationships that you build along the way.
That's so true, though. I mean, you have to have good relationship with people. I mean, that's kind of like one of the biggest things, like the communication, but it's just like the building rapport with individuals is huge. Like you want them to trust
100%.
you. And it's like, if they don't trust you, it's just like, oh, like he's just our coach, like, whatever. It's just like any type of sporting club or sporting event, like those players should respect the head coach. And it's not necessarily just the head coach, it's the other assistant coaches and the other types of coaching staff that are there to help them succeed. And that's 100%. Huge.
And the reality is, like, I mean, I work for the players. You know what I mean? Like I work for the coach, the club pays me, but at the same time, the players aren't paying for me to give them a service. They're here, we're paying them to come to our club, and so I'm working to help them succeed, and to help them understand that's, I think, a huge part of, being able to manage those guys, because in a team sport environment, I don't care what level you're at, if it's college, if it's professional, if it's youth, it's not a dictatorship. There's got to be a level of democracy in what we're doing, and everyone has to have a say. Now, ultimately, it's going to come down to how the head coach wants to do things because it falls on his shoulders. But I think it's kind of, especially as a strength conditioning coach, our role to ride that line of, delivering what the head coach wants while also finding and understanding the needs of, the many different personalities that you're dealing with.
I love that you just said that, man. Like, that is so true. Like, there are so many. I mean, how many players do you have?
Yeah, we have 28 players on our senior team roster with ages ranging from 15 to 34 years old.
And that's huge. Like, knowing the age range and just knowing that you have that many athletes, like, personalities are going to be huge. Like,
For
so
sure.
many. And you need to understand that it's just like some of them might have a harder time going into different types of situations while other ones are experienced with it. I mean, you got your 34-year-old, 30-year-old that, okay, I've done this before. I know what to do in this situation. And then that brings a big arrangement into it. Kind of leading into my next question, multiple athletes within a setting. I mean, you said 28, right?
Yeah, 28 on our senior team roster.
That could be difficult, like having that many people. And, there's definitely some other conditioning coaches or strength and conditioning coaches that have 50 athletes to 60 athletes to 30 athletes. But that could be difficult to manage them. Like, what do you do to kind of help manage those teams and your players?
Yeah, I think it obviously depends with the age group that we have, So just, I guess, a little background. And we have, obviously, as I mentioned before, kind of a youth academy system. U12, 13, 14 is our kind of developmental. And then we have our performance-based academy, U17 and U19.
Yep.
And then with that, we have a lot of those U17, U19 kids that we push into our USL team.
Yep.
So then if you have a 28-man roster on the USL team, we really cut that in half to, have 13 to 14 guys on that roster. And then the rest of those kids will be academy kids that kind of fulfill that team. Yep. So as you're pushing U17, U19 kids up, you're pushing the U12, 13, all those kids up. And then, we take some of those USL high-performing academy players, and then they come into our first team environment. So we really have to manage it kind of from the top down when we think of the youth all the way up, and looking at just the general structure of everything. And I don't know if we do it the right way, but I think we have a pretty good system in at least understanding kind of where kids are within age groups. And that's an easy way to communicate to the coaches. So we kind of look at, working from the bottom, U12, U13, U14, U15 is kind of our I guess, puberty age groups. So we have pre-puberty, we have kind of like your circumpubescent, the kids that are still in the midst of their highest growth spurts, and then we have our post-puberty. Okay. So within that, we do a peak height velocity test, okay, which we're going to, basically assess where they're at in their development stage. And with that measurement, we can basically determine U12, U13, some of the 14s are going to be those pre-puberty kids that we're just focusing on strictly movement variability, movement competency, just exposing them to different movement patterns on the field. So that's pretty much done just through warm up and games. Okay. We'll do handball, we'll do gymnastics, tumbling, stuff like that. And then going into kind of our circumpubescent group, the kids that are in the midst of their growth spurt, some of those U14s, a lot of our U15s, and some of our U17s. Those kids, we're starting to now introduce just fundamental patterns in the weight room, not necessarily loading them, but more providing the load through variability. And then we're loading now after those kids have kind of passed their growth spurt, we're going into our U17, U19, where the kids are now really starting to get to a stage where their body's flowing with hormones. We can really start to load them up. We can train them from a very general standpoint, but start to build them up as athletes, well-rounded. And then it's managing kind of our USL team, which is really a mixture of, some 24, 25-year-old guys on the high end of the age group to now mixing in a lot of those 17, 18, 19-year-old kids. Yeah. And so with that, we kind of take a similar approach that we do with our senior team, which is first look at it with a couple layers. The first kind of being the training age. So, what is the athlete's exposure to traditional strength conditioning? And we say traditional strength conditioning because we get guys coming in at 28, 29 years old, but they may have played in South America the whole career. And their idea of working with a fitness coach is not what we perceive it as, so whatever you think of traditional American stuff in the weight room, traditional patterns, maybe they haven't been exposed to.
Yeah.
So we kind of grade them on a training age scale, where it's going to be your first 0 to 2 years, 2 to 4 years, and then greater than 4 years, as in no training age, limited training age, and high training age.
Yeah.
And so that's a big one is, okay, now we've bucketed those guys into low training age, high training age. With that, then we start to do more of a needs analysis. And with the needs analysis, it's pretty simple. I think for a while, when I first was getting into the team sport environment, everyone talks about specificity, and how do we individualize everything? And especially coaches, that's like their favorite buzzword. They're always like, hey, how do we make it super specific for our wingers and for our forwards and our outside backs? They should all be doing completely different stuff in the weight room, right? Yeah. And in theory, yes. But I think logistically, it doesn't necessarily always make sense. Trying to make sure the athletes are given the right stimulus at the right time, and doing that consistently is our number one goal. Yeah. But as long as we're doing that, then we kind of take it back to the needs analysis a little bit. And that's first just looking at their age. We look at the level of strength that the guys have. We look at their body composition. We look at their conditioning levels, what type of aerobic base do they have. Then we look at a couple range of motion tests. We do some isolated joint range of motion. We do hip, active, and passive range, and kind of look at the ratio there. And then we do just a general movement screen. We do the FMS. Okay. So we don't use it as any sort of injury predictors, but we use it more as an injury risk profile is what we call it. And honestly, I completely stole that idea. I saw it on a blog I got a while back. I can't remember who put it together, but we took a scale where now you have your strength. You have a 3 as a high risk, 2 as a moderate risk, and 1 as a low risk. Basically being, with like a 3 RM trap bar deadlift, if they can do 1.5 times their body weight, low risk. And then we basically take that down to be moderate risk and high risk with the decreasing levels of strength. So then we do that with all that. Now that we've kind of bucketed those guys with low training age, high training age, we then take the guys with the high training age and say, okay, well, are they low risk, moderate risk, or high risk? Okay. And then with that, if they're low risk or moderate risk, if they're moderate risk or high risk, then we work with our medical staff and determine what those risk factors are and if there's anything that we need to address. Typically, the stuff that needs to be addressed is going to be the way we structure our pre-training routine. So the guys have to be in the gym 25 minutes before training. Some of the guys are doing very general work, and some of the guys are doing more specific work. Okay. And the specific work comes from the guys that are high training age and high risk. And all of our low training age guys, whether they're low risk or high risk, we're pretty much just addressing very general means of development with those guys. Okay. And what I mean by that is how can we just enhance cardiovascular fitness? How do we enhance general range of motion? How do we enhance general strength before we're really trying to get to anything that's more max effort, if you will? Absolutely. So I guess from that standpoint, it's just having a good idea of where the guys are. And so then once you get into the weight room, we have a very clear understanding of the team that we're working with. And it really just comes to doing our due diligence. We do interviews with all the guys. Nice. Go over our expectations with them, go over their risk profile, talk to them about where our areas of concern are, get them understanding why those are areas of concern so that they can understand why we want to work on them. And then also for us to let them know if you got a guy that's coming in 29 years old, he may want to do some of his own stuff in the weight room, but we just want to tell him, hey, all we're trying to improve right now is the quality of your movement. So that's our number one goal with you in the weight room. So when we're giving these exercises, don't worry about what, the other guy's doing, because it may look cool that he's loading up the hex bar deadlift. But for you right now, we're just going to be focusing on a single leg RDL. We're going to regress that pattern for you, and we're going to really make sure that you know how to move well before we load you up. Absolutely. So I guess taking that into the program, and this is kind of with the whole specificity thing for a while, is how do we make it so specific? I don't think it has to be so specific per position or per individual, but what exercise is best suited for that individual at that moment in time? So if there's a guy that can't move well, if he has some sort of disc pathology in his low back, then we're usually just going to stray away from some of the hex bar deadlifts. That may be the staple in the main idea for what we want to do on that day, but we can accomplish that a number of other ways, whether it's a kettlebell deadlift, whether it's a single leg RDL, whether it's maybe more of a knee dominant hamstring if we have to regress even further. But just taking that with the program that we have up on the board, and it's always, this idea is from Dan Paff with Altus, where we always have a plan B and a plan C exercise selection.
Yep.
And so with that, there's workout A up there. And now I've already told the guys after we met with them, hey, you're going to be in our plan B group or you're going to be in our plan C group.
Nice.
So as we have that tier system of high training age, low training age, high risk, low risk, then we meet with them and we talk about it. And at least when we're in the weight room, they understand you're A, B, or C.
Nice.
And then from there, it's just managing the program with how we're trying to accomplish our general goals, and then making sure that individual's getting the exercise he needs. That's not gonna cause harm to him, but hopefully it's just gonna improve his movement quality, and eventually over time, not allow anything to occur as far as atrophy goes in season, that he can just maintain the stimulus that he needs.
Absolutely.
So hopefully that makes sense, and especially with from the top down approach, it's very general with our youth as we move up. We really get those guys in the gym a lot once they hit kind of that towards the end of their puberty, because again, we're trying to prepare them for the demands of the professional game.
Yep.
And it's not to say that every one of them is going to get there, but that's the biggest thing. The coach's eye from what the soccer coaches are saying is, oh, well, that kid's too small. I just want him to get bigger and stronger. And as much as strength doesn't necessarily correlate to improvement on the field, there's basic minimum requirements that you need to have to be able to be a professional athlete, or even to be an athlete at the collegiate level.
Absolutely. That's awesome, man. I mean, the one big thing that I took away from that is there's multiple things, and I'm definitely going to talk about them, but I love the fact that you do communicate with the athletic trainers and the medical staff. I mean, I think that's huge. I think bridging the gap in between those is something that's critical within rehabilitation to medical practices and just strength and conditioning in general. And it's like, if you have that medical staff and support with you, like, use those resources. I think a lot of individuals necessarily don't use them, and
sure.
It's lacking within the industry. And I think it should continue to grow, because it's like,
yep.
Necessarily where you hear someone like the medical staff or the ATCs are the current strength and conditioning coaches, like, and it's budget, there's some budget concerns definitely when it comes in the collegiate setting. But if you have that opportunity to keep working with them, like you said, like, that obviously can help them when they come in 20 to 30 minutes earlier. Then they can obviously have that guided program that might be necessarily medical based, or it might be rehabilitative based, or it might be aerobically based. I mean, there's a lot of different things that obviously they can help out with.
Yep.
And we really talked about movement quality. That is, like, I love that. Like, I think that's one of those things that, don't get me wrong. Like, I've talked about this, and it was actually one of the other Train Smart episodes that I've done, is when some, get out of like the range of like optimal movement patterns, and there's some people that say, what is optimal movement? What is the quality? What's like the breaking point? But I mean, that's the superior part of it, because we do hope, just from the research and the literature that has been provided already, that it is going to kind of fill that gap and lead into better movement quality in games. And hopefully when you move better in a game, what it could result to is a W, a win.
Yep.
So,
it's so true, man. And we're so fortunate. We have an unbelievable medical team, and working with those guys makes my job so much easier. And especially since I moved into this new role, we've been a bit shorthanded. So those guys are so more than capable on so many levels, and I think we do a really good job of. Sue Falsone, in her book Bridging the Gap, she wrote something. It's not in terms of the return to play continuum. Mm-hmm. Not about who's overseeing the whole process. It's just everyone is the quarterback at a different point in the process. And we like to kind of think about that within the whole development of our team, is we're all capable of doing more than maybe what our role is, but it's just, we're different. We're quarterbacks for different scenarios, and we all just are able to help each other out. One thing that we have in common, which has been huge, and I know you have a little bit of that background, is we all have some sort of exos ties. Mm-hmm. So in terms of how we term everything, kind of the philosophy of what we do, we all have that understanding. And that's one thing we try to ask of our ATCs, everyone that comes in, is at least just getting them the XPS certification through Exos, just because they have a good system. They've put something together that, I think has been great in terms of getting everyone on the same page. So bridging the gap between their department and ours is huge. We meet every morning. We meet every afternoon, going through every player on our roster. I communicate what I've saw with my meetings with the coaches. They communicate the treatments that they did on the athletes in the afternoon. So then when we come into the session every day, we know exactly where every player is, and that's been a huge added bonus.
Absolutely, man. I mean, that's the thing. It's like when you kind of have that similar methodology and everyone's on the same page, like it adds the communication to be so much better.
For sure.
That's huge. Like if you lack in communication, like that obviously can provide decrements within any type of training program. Like your body doesn't necessarily respond the right way, as your staff isn't necessarily on the communication. So it's like, well, where do we go? And I love the fact that you just said, like, everyone's a quarterback some way in shape or form within that training program. You might be like 2 months away from now, you might be the quarterback, but then the medical staff might be the current quarterback at that time. And I love that. It's actually a really good saying. But I kind of wanted to go into the next one, which if I wanted to explain, how I met you. So we had the opportunity to speak at the NSCA Missouri State Clinic about probably 5-6 months ago. And you had a good presentation on just talking about acute to chronic workload ratios.
Yep.
And a lot of it is talking about looking at like GPS and all that. And that's one of those things, if you have GPS technology, like thumbs up, because it is something that a lot of facilities can be using to help out with their training programming and just looking out for that actually workload ratio, just because you're like, okay, they took on a little bit more and then obviously now we need to draw back. But kind of wanted you to explain a little bit more, because I know you talked about this when you were presenting as well. Some coaches or facilities might not necessarily have that budget to order a GPS technology such as Catapult or something.
Yep.
What would you recommend to kind of determine workload ratios, acute and chronic, for individuals that necessarily don't have that budget?
Yeah, I think, like you said, it's great if you have GPS, but, I think there's other means. And I know we kind of focus more on the development of teams in the weight room, but especially in the team environment, I just want to make sure it's on record. That's such a small piece of what we do. You know what I mean? In terms of the whole picture, it's just one component. It's not like that's going to change anything. The guys are field sport athletes, so the stuff we do on the field is king. And so just make sure I say that. But in terms of monitoring the load on the field, I think, again, it just comes back to how can you be best aware of the types of work that your players are going through, and begin to understand that. So a simple way is, I'm sure a lot of people have heard of it, but just as long as you're getting a session RPE, and that's basically just going to be a 1 to 10, asking the athlete, how hard was the session? 10's going to be excruciating hard, and 1's going to be, a walk in the park. And I think however you want to deliver that to your athletes, that's kind of up to you. There's, different scales online that you can use in terms of what you should actually ask if you want to maybe follow the research. But as long as you're getting a gauge of 1 to 10, what is it? They gave you a number. And for me, that would be the intensity of the session. How hard was it for you? Okay, now you got the intensity. So then just time on feet, time on the field, the duration of the session, that would be your volume metric. So you kind of now have an intensity, you have a volume. And if you want a true training load, then all you have to do is just multiply those RPE times duration, and now you get training load. And so to be able to use that measure is huge. And we also use that measure. We use that as our primary source of internal stress with our guys, just because, as we've talked about with all of your research, heart rate monitors can be a bit finicky, especially on the field. So this is the most consistent way that we can measure internal stress. How are the guys feel like they're responding to the session? So once you get that training load variable, RPE times duration, then you just keep track of that every day. And then it would be an easy calculation, basically, where you would take the current week's sum, so 7-day rolling average of the training load, and then you would divide that by the prior 4-week average of training load. Okay. And the idea is that what the ratio that you get is, if you're 0.8 to 1.3, you're in a safe zone. Okay. Right? So 0.8 to 1.3 means that there's not a large acute spike in the training load. that during that current week, you haven't done a lot more than you've done in the prior 4 weeks.
Yep.
Right? So what you want to eventually see is that if you're in that zone, that's kind of your sweet spot.
Yep.
Now, I think there's a lot of gray area on that 0.8 to 1.3, and Tim Gabbett will even say that with a lot of his research being on cricket. It's not meant to be a hard line. But I think once you start collecting data, whether it's for just an athlete in the weight room, whether it's a team sport environment, you start to find, okay, these are kind of the norms. You know, maybe it's 1 to 1.4. But the biggest thing is that you're not seeing a big change or a big drop. You know, the idea is that if you're dropping below 0.8, then you're kind of in that undertraining zone.
Yeah.
You know, so now the guys aren't getting enough of a stimulus. And then when they're exposed to a higher stimulus again, then it's going to spike too much.
Yeah.
You know, so what we've kind of found is typically around 1.5 is pretty good for us. If we start seeing stuff above 2.3, 2.4, you know, stuff that's below 1, we know either it's been too much or we're detraining them.
Absolutely.
So it's just an easy indicator. It's definitely not the be all end all. We've seen plenty of scenarios where, you know, guys are 2.8, you know, going through the roof, and we're like, oh geez, like this guy's must be, you know, dying out there. And then you talk to the player, and you know, he seems to be doing fine. He goes through the next 5 training sessions, nothing happens, and you're kind of like, okay, well, you know, that's just an indicator. Maybe you just need to communicate to the athlete to do some extra recovery.
Absolutely.
You know, and just kind of make sure that he's taking care of himself. He's sleeping well. He's staying hydrated. He's eating well. You know, hit those 3 big rocks first, always, and then maybe there's some other modalities and other stuff that we can help him with.
Yeah, absolutely.
That's probably the easiest way and most cost effective, but also probably one of the most well-tested standards within research of monitoring training load.
Absolutely. It's simple.
Yeah, it's very simple.
And that's awesome, because I mean, it adds something to individuals that are like, oh, I don't have GPS, I can't do it. No, you can.
Exactly.
It might take a little bit more work. And kind of coming off that, like, how do you put them like in Excel sheets? Like, do you write them down on paper and then transfer it? Like, how do you do that?
Yeah, so we do it a couple different ways. We have an athlete management system online. It's called Conduct, that we put all of our testing data in, all of our GPS data, and then our RPs and duration, which basically it has a form in there, kind of like Google Sheets, which I know a lot of people use, where you just type in every day the RP, the duration, and then it'll create the training load for you.
Nice.
They'll just track that over time, and then we put the acute chronic ratio calculation in there.
Nice.
But I personally do some other stuff in Excel.
Okay.
You know, basically I work everything back from our MASH demands. So I use acute chronic as just an indicator, kind of an alarm system, but I plan our weeks based off of what % of match day load we're trying to get.
Okay.
Say total distance. You know, if the guy gets 11 kilometers in the game, you know, maybe we want to double that in a week. So maybe we're looking at 22 kilometers during a week. And then what % of that do we want to get on each day? And it was a similar idea within the literature. I found that anything that's greater than 10% per week or less than 10% per week is kind of within that sweet spot.
Nice. That's awesome. I love that. I've heard about Conduct and everything, and I've heard that it's like one of those softwares that integrates so many different types of platforms and softwares out there, and I've heard good things about it, and I'm happy that you use that, and we're able to provide like a little bit of a rationale behind like why you use it and everything. Just because I think kind of like with the new modern age of just programming and coaching, you know, I think we are still using like Excel sheets and everything like that, which is fine because I still use them too. But it's like, I think we're now moving in towards like the realm of different softwares and platforms that are integrated together or just basically incorporate everything together, which is awesome. Like, I think with technology, it's helped out our field, but then there's some things that it hasn't.
For sure.
But I mean, that's awesome that you can use that technology, because I think it helps. Like if you aren't monitoring some sort of internal, external workload within your athletes, you could potentially sacrifice some recovery time, you know, making things a little bit more customized for each individual. And I know that you talked about this within the presentation that we had in the Missouri State Clinic, is you were talking about like, you know, kind of like, hey, maybe this athlete needs to draw back a little bit just because they put a lot of time in the game.
Yep.
And the individual that didn't necessarily, we might be able to amp them up a little bit more within their training session to work them a little bit more so that they can obviously still get an adaptation from the response that they're getting from training.
100%. Yep.
Yeah, so That's awesome, man. We talked about so many good things, and I loved everything that we talked about. You definitely have a brilliant mind when it comes to just looking at all these different variables that individuals should be looking at. And, you know, being that director of sports performance for your club, you need to be aware of that. And, you know, and I like that you've stated like so many different, like, oh, this book, and okay, yeah, this literature, okay, then this book, and then this individual, this professional, and you talked about that, which is awesome. Just because now our listeners can actually be like, oh, I'm going to go look at that book.
For sure. And I mean, I think there's no original ideas out there anymore. I mean, we're just, you know, a lot of times just regurgitating what we've heard, but I mean, that's the way we learn, right? Is just finding good practitioners and good people like yourself that we can learn from and take ideas from. And, you know, and then you have to kind of see if they work in your environment and the athletes that you're working with, because, you know, you don't want to use a program to fit the athlete. You know, you need to find out what works for them.
Absolutely. Like, and it's hard, like you said, like, you know, specificity when you're talking about the needs analysis is huge. Like, you know, there's some things that, you know, position coordinated might be something, but in the beginning of the day, it's like about movement quality. If your athlete can't necessarily move great,
yep,
maybe we need to take a step back, like squat. Like, I'm a big person on like doing your fundamental movement patterns. And if they can't do the fundamental movement patterns, like,
sure,
might not necessarily want to load them up. Like you talked about regressing them.
yeah. And soccer players don't move well. Put on record. Very asymmetrical sport, you know, all one-sided, you know, a lot of hip problems, a lot of low back problems, you know, rotational dominance in the hip with the lack of internal rotation. I mean, they're just getting sheer forces. So a lot of it is in season just restoring health as opposed to trying to improve performance, you know.
Absolutely. Well, thanks, man. I mean, honestly, anything that we talked about today, how can people get in contact with you? Instagram, Facebook, or how would you recommend?
Yeah, you know, I don't know my Twitter handle off the top of my head, or I think my Instagram is like Joey_Harty. Both of them have my name in it. But yeah, I mean, I'm always an open book. I'd be happy sharing my email address. I can give you that to put in the notes or something.
Okay, absolutely.
But yeah, people look me up on LinkedIn. I always love talking shop with other practitioners. So yeah.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Joey. Take it easy. I hope you have a good rest of your day.
Thanks for having me on, Dane. It's great talking.
Yep. Bye.
All right, see you, man.